Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. I feel like I haven't hosted in a while, and I'm happy to be back here with all of you today. Don't forget, I'm going to make my every podcast that I host plea for you to review us on Apple Podcasts. The more reviews that we get, the more people are able to find us and get the help that we're putting out there into the world that if you are listening, you presumably value. So if you would, we would really appreciate it. We have a bunch of great things that we're talking about today, including preparing to spend your college savings. There are some things you want to think about as you get thinking about doing that, and we're going to tell you what that is. And we're also going to offer some Common App updates. The Common App has just done an update and provided an update for all of the counselors out there, and we're going to share the highlights with you. But before we get to that, we wanted to talk today about colleges whose names may not relate to the actual student experience. And joining me for that conversation is Heath Einstein, who is the Dean of Admissions at Texas Christian University, or TCU. Hi, Heath.
Hi, Beth. How are you?
I'm good, and I appreciate you joining us today. And I'm excited to talk about this because I feel like sometimes we put schools on students' lists and they get upset based on the school's name. And, we're trying to dispel a few myths out there about the name and the actual experience that students are going to have. So, why don't we start with, can you tell us about TCU, which, as I mentioned in my intro, is Texas Christian University? Suggests it's a place for Christian students, but is that actually the case?
It's a great question, Beth. And first of all, thank you for having me. I spent 8 years of my career in high schools making those lists and having those exact same reactions sent back to me. So I very much can appreciate what you've experienced. Texas Christian University is a medium-sized national private liberal arts and sciences university with fantastic research opportunities and wonderful pre-professional programs. We have 8 undergraduate degree granting colleges within TCU, but every student completes what we call our core curriculum. So whether you start as a nursing major and change to religion, or you are a dance student or an English student or business student or whatever, everyone is going to be completing this core curriculum because we believe that there are certain types of courses, certain disciplines that all students should have exposure to in order to be a contributing member of society. Baked into that core curriculum, one of our requirements is a class in a religious tradition. But notice I say a religious tradition, not
Yes.
the religious tradition or a particular religious tradition. So certainly at Texas Christian University, we offer many courses in Christianity, but the assumption is not that every student here is Christian, nor are they interested necessarily in exploring Christianity. And so a student could satisfy that religious tradition requirement by completing a course in Caribbean religions or Eastern religions, and they would be in exactly the same position in terms of meeting their graduation requirement. TCU was founded in 1873 by 2 ministers of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. And in order to fully understand TCU, one has to have at least a basic understanding of the DOC, which is a fairly small Protestant denomination found largely in the Midwestern part of the United States. The DOC believes strongly in this idea of faith with reason. That is, we don't accept ideas just at face value, but only through rigorous exploration do we come to some greater understanding of the world around us. And the disciples also don't believe, and this is really key, that there is one right path. And so because of that, this has always been an ecumenical university founded by a faith that is ecumenical. So we have students here who are Christian, to be sure, but we have students here who are Muslim and Jewish and Hindu and Baha'i and students of no faith. There's no requirement that students sign a statement of faith when they come here. I think the interesting thing is, as you were sort of alluding to earlier, is the expectation that some people have when they see the name written on a piece of paper.
Right.
You put the words Texas and Christian next to each other, and there is a certain assumption about what this institution is or isn't. And I would suggest that this is a far more diverse place than people would assume, and a far more interesting place, therefore, because you're coming into contact with people who don't necessarily share your worldviews or your lived experience. And so TCU is really quite a fascinating place. That is not to suggest that if you are a person of faith, that you're going to feel like a stranger here. Quite the contrary. This is a place where faith is accepted, explored, as I mentioned, through our core curriculum. It's a place where we have many different faith communities. And so for a student for whom faith is really important, they're going to find a lot of fellowship at TCU, opportunities for mission work, opportunities to connect in churches, on campus, around campus. It's just that there isn't an expectation of the student. It is purely an individual choice.
Right. And so, from that perspective, would you consider TCU a secular university, or do you think that because of that religious requirement, that there is discussion of faith that's somewhat pervasive on campus, or not necessarily if you don't want to have those discussions?
It's a really great question, Beth, and I don't know that there's a simple answer to it. We are not a secular university. We are a religiously affiliated institution, and proudly so, but one in which, as I said, all faiths are welcome, and students of no faith. I think the conversations are prevalent in and out of the classroom, but again, to the extent that a student is interested. So let's say a student is atheist, and they're not especially interested in exploring faith. They're going to be taking that one class, but that is a class that's taught from an academic perspective. It's not a didactic or a course. And so a student can very comfortably navigate the waters here at TCU, having no particular faith persuasion.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And it occurs to me, or one thing that I'm curious about is what your thoughts were in taking this job. Right, you're the dean of admissions at Texas Christian University, but your own faith, as I understand it, is not that of a Christian. So what was that like, and did you have any trepidation, and what's been your experience since arriving at TCU?
So it's such an interesting question, Beth, because when I told people that I was coming to Texas Christian University, as somebody who strongly identifies as a Jew, that struck people as very odd.
Sure.
And to be honest, it struck me as a little odd when I was first exploring the opportunity of coming here. I was coming from an independent school locally here in North Texas, having sent a couple of students to TCU in the past, but not knowing it all that well.
Right.
And then I came here on a counselor tour. And so I got to know the university pretty well that way. And I became friendly with several people on the admissions staff and got to know the people here. And I thought, well, this is actually a really special place. I mean, the people who are at TCU just bleed purple. I mean, I have been to hundreds of college campuses, as you have.
Yes.
And you can tell the places that just pop. And
Yep.
TCU was one of those places. The street signs are in purple. There are horned frogs, which is our mascot, etched into the chairs. I mean, the spirit on this campus is just overflowing. And so there's something that very attractive about that to me. Also, as somebody who, again, strongly identifies with my religion, I really respected the fact that this was a community where all religions were respected. And so the transition for me was fairly seamless. Interestingly, there was an article that was written about me in the Texas Jewish Post. Could you imagine there's such a publication called the Texas Jewish Post?
Right.
And the headline was "A Jew at TCU." And we spent a good deal of time exploring what that would mean, and how comfortable or uncomfortable one could be on this campus. I have not had a single negative experience in 10 years here. Again, on the contrary, people are so open to discussing religion and exploring, and people on our staff want to talk about it. And so it's been very comfortable. We have people on our staff. I've got a staff here in the Office of Admission of about 40 people, and I think rather representative of the campus community as a whole. We've got people of various faiths on our staff here.
Well, and I always think that when you think about a religious affiliated institution, generally speaking, the people who are running the institution are typically should be representative of what the vibe is going to be like on campus. So if it's ultra conservative at the top, there's a good chance, not necessarily for sure, but that might filter down into the student body, because the ultra religious is probably going to permeate all of the programs, and it's just kind of going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it is interesting that that TCU is comfortable hiring a Jewish person to be their director or their dean of admissions, and that as you point out, amongst your admission staff, which are really the front line for any institution, is very representative of the country as a whole and not of a small portion of the country who happen to consider themselves Christian. So that always bodes well. I'm curious if there are other schools out there that come to mind for you where you feel like I have some thoughts myself, but where the name of the school might connotate one image, but the reality of the school is entirely different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's a good question, Beth, and I think that if we are limiting to sort of religious institutions where there are names, I think the obvious one that comes to mind here locally, especially when one thinks of TCU, often we are put together with our neighbors to the east, SMU, Southern Methodist
Yes.
University.
Yep.
TCU is located in Fort Worth. SMU's in Dallas. These are sister cities. Our campus is less than an hour from SMU. And similarly, I don't think there is anything about the experience for the average SMU student that would scream Methodist.
Right. Right.
And yet I'm sure that there are students who cross SMU off their list because of that. We are the only mainstream Protestant university with the word Christian in our name. So I think we are unique in that way,
Right.
Unlike some of the other schools. But you could broaden this in ways and say, okay, well, there's a school in Worcester, Mass called Assumption University. Does that mean everyone there makes assumptions? So I would say, like, to any student, you need to get beyond just the name and try to understand what the school values, what the school is looking for in its students, what the school offers to prospective students,
Right.
and try to get past the name. The flip side of that is there are lots and lots of schools in the United States that either are currently affiliated with a religion or were more likely founded
Yes.
by some religion, and you would never know it because the name of the religion isn't in the school. And off the top of my head, I could think of several places, like Muhlenberg College, where my brother graduated from, is a Lutheran affiliated institution. About a third of their students are Jewish.
Right.
Duke, Emory, GW, these are places, and largely places that were founded in the 19th century or before, where you're going to see that tie, but it doesn't mean that today it's going to mean much for the experience of the student.
Yeah, I agree. It feels like there are a handful of colleges out there that people have been willing to kind of overlook the religious affiliation, but for some reason, because they're willing to look more closely, like a Boston College, which is in my backyard here.
Right.
It's a Catholic school, but if you look more closely at the actual requirements, it's not, you can go and do virtual, it's not a religious school from that perspective. It is, but it isn't. And people are more than willing to overlook that, and because they love the idea of Boston College.
Sure.
I'm curious from your perspective of the kinds of things you would advise students to do to get past the name of the college. Where do you look to see what is this actually going to be like versus what the name would suggest it might be like?
Yeah, I think that colleges do a pretty good job now of putting content out there that will allow students to get a good sense of the vibe of the place. YouTube is one place
Yes.
to start. I mean, we're all putting out lots of digital content that students can consume fairly easily. You don't have to leave your room to do that. You don't have to go on a campus tour. Another thing I would suggest is talking to people who have attended the institution. So you might recommend a school to a student and they might immediately sort of out of hand discard the idea. But if you say, hey, I know somebody who went there, and you put them in touch with that person, that's a great way to sort of explore what the place is actually like.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think looking at course requirements, right? You have a specific requirement, but then looking further, okay, well, I have to take this religion class, but what are my options?
Right.
And sometimes those options will either be plentiful or the option that's available is much more an academic, almost a survey course of religions in general. There can be a wide variety, and that should tell you something as well about, and then looking for other student organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So, are there Jewish student organizations? If you're a Jewish student considering a place like SMU or TCU or something else, what's there for you on
Sure.
campus? And if you find nothing, it's possible then that that might not be a great fit. But if you see that there are those organizations, they already exist, that tells you that there is a healthy group of students in those populations already there.
I also think it helps to understand a little bit about the um, the religious um, the religion that the university is founded under.
Yes. Yeah.
Because to the point you made earlier about BC, I have a graduate degree from Georgetown University in
Hmm.
Washington D.C. That's a Jesuit university. First of all, if you know anything about Jesuits, that tells you something right there. You know how highly emphasized education is, um, and for me, it was very easy to say I'd like to go to school here because once you get beyond the sort of iconography of having a crucifix on every wall, there's nothing that's particularly um, you know required about the student experience, at least the graduate level. I can't speak for the undergraduate. Nobody's forcing you to go to church. So, but every college is a little bit different, and there certainly are Catholic schools where that is going to be a requirement. And
Yes.
I think the advice that you provided about digging into the student groups is a really, really good piece of advice.
Yeah. Heath, thank you so much for taking time today to talk to us. This has been great. I learned more about TCU, which is always a good thing, learning more about more colleges that are out there. Now I'm excited. I love purple. I have to come down. I'm going to be in Texas in September, so maybe I can make a side trip to visit your campus.
We will be having events around NACAC for counselors, so definitely make a trip up to North Texas from down from Houston.
All right, wonderful. And we'll encourage our listeners as well. Check out TCU. There's this great thing called the internet, and it makes it inexpensive way to get exposure to the school. Thanks so much again, Heath. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Beth. Pleasure.